Monday evening. We've got a great broadcast for you this evening. We're changing the format a little this evening, so stay close with us here. But once again, our broadcast is, of course, it's open to anyone, but we like to try and focus on the Hoosiers here in the state of Indiana. Any of you that perhaps would like to learn more about our movement and get involved, as well as those of you that maybe are already involved and just want to learn more about Convention of States. So let me bring myself up here and introduce myself. My name's Dale Parrish. I am the state director for Convention of States here in Indiana. And once again, just want to let you know that we're trying to reach out to the Hoosiers here in the state of Indiana and anyone that maybe would be interested in our movement. So that's the purpose of our broadcast. Now, before we go any further, I want to explain something to you. In the event that this broadcast would just abruptly end, don't stay on. Don't wait for us to come back on. This has happened, by the way, and I just want to let you know that based on our experience, if this happens, it'll be a technology issue. But if it does happen, everything just shuts down. So it just takes too long for us to get everything up and running again. So I don't want you to have to wait for that to happen. So if we go blank, then just put us on your calendar for next Monday evening, and be sure to tune in at that time, and we'll resume at that point in time. All right, I want to cover just some general things with you to begin with, and I'm going to, let's see here. I got to know I need to bring up this other thing here. Like I said, we're changing our format a little bit tonight. So we're going to do an introduction here, and then I'm going to bring on our guest for this evening, and we're having Paul Phillips back again this evening. Paul and I are going to talk about term limits, a really interesting topic. And after our discussion on term limits, then we'll do the presentation on the basics of Convention of States. So little change in format tonight. So bear with us here as we get going, and I'll get the slideshow initiated here so you can easily see and won't have any problem seeing what we're trying to do here. Okay, we're going to start from the beginning here. I don't know what's happening here. Come on, guys. Let's bring it on up here. Okay. Okay, let me try this one more time. Sorry, folks. All right, I don't know what's happening here. Well, anyway, we'll just go with what we have here then. What I wanted to mention to you was that I wanted to inform you on the resources that we have here available to us in Indiana and nationally. And first of all, we have the Convention of States website, the national website, and you'll hear us refer to that frequently, and that will, whoops, well, I was trying to do it again, and it's not working there for some reason. So conventionofstates.com, that is our national website, and that's the website that has a wealth of information for everyone. So, and you'll hear us refer to that frequently. Embedded in that national website is the state website for Indiana, which would be located at conventionofstates.com/Indiana. Also, then on our social media platforms, Facebook, we're on Facebook at Convention of States, Indiana. As a matter of fact, our broadcast this evening is coming to you through that Facebook page. We're also on the YouTube channel, COS Indiana. Now, that YouTube channel is primarily an educational resource for those of you here are as well as leadership in Convention of States. We have PowerPoint presentations. We have recordings of our broadcast, and we have links to Paul's podcast. Our guest this evening does a series of podcasts called the Free to Be Free podcast. And so we have links to all of Paul's podcasts on the YouTube channel. So I would encourage you to check that out and be sure to subscribe while you're there, as a matter of fact. Some other platforms we're on, Twitter, hashtag COS Indiana. We're on Instagram, Convention of States Indiana. We're getting set up on LinkedIn, and we have some other platforms that we're looking into maintaining a presence. So it should be easy to find us out there. Okay, well, a few numbers here just quickly. In 2018, we surpassed 30,000 supporters here in Indiana, and we've been growing very, very fast, about a 40% growth rate. So we've set our goal for 2019 to reach 40,000 supporters. So we're very, very interested, very anxious to reach that goal, and we're off to a really great start this year. So I really feel confident we're going to achieve that goal. About 2,900 volunteers, people that have indicated a willingness to help out as needed. And we have right now about 40 individuals in leadership positions within our Convention of States here in Indiana. And if you have any interest in getting involved with us, I would encourage you to go to that website, that national website, conventionofstates.com, click on the menu selection, Take Action, and scroll down and look at the different positions that we have available. If anyone is of interest to you, open it up and read more about it. And if you're still interested, go ahead and make application. Now, you're not obligated in any way, but what that does is then your name will come up on a report that we see every day, and one of us will then be in contact with you to discuss your interest further. So really encourage you to do that. We always need more people in leadership positions. So please take a look at the website and look into that if you have any interest at all. Let me close here on our introduction with our vision statement here in Indiana. Our vision is to build a Hoosier grassroots community of citizens and legislators dedicated to the constitutional concept of self-governance. So everything that we do here in the state of Indiana, we're doing and oriented toward the accomplishing this vision someday here in the state of Indiana. Okay, let's take that out, and I want to bring on our guest this evening. As I mentioned before, we're bringing back in Paul Phillips. Hi, Paul.
Hey, Dale. How are you tonight?
Good, good. Well, except my PowerPoint's not working like I wanted it to work. But anyway, Paul is our legislative liaison for the state of Indiana, and also serves as vice state director. So, and Paul has written, as a matter of fact, has created a podcast covering this topic of term limits, and I've generated a narrated PowerPoint presentation about this topic of term limits. Both of them are on the YouTube channel, COS Indiana. So we both have done some research on this topic, and so we should have a lot of things to talk about tonight. And let's just get started, Paul. As I said earlier, that our topic this evening would in fact be term limits. And we're going to be talking about term limits for both Congress and the federal judiciary. Am I correct?
Yes, our application is broad enough in the area of term limits that actually includes any federal officials. It could even go to members of the administrative state as well.
Okay. And just to be clear, this could and would also include Supreme Court judges. So the whole gambit, right?
Right.
Now, what I found, Paul, in my research was that actually amongst the surveys of people in Convention of States, that the term limits possible amendment is the second most popular one, and that the most popular amendment would have to do with a balanced budget or some spending controls. But did you find the same thing?
Yeah, term limits are very popular because it's kind of an easy thing to understand, and there's kind of this visceral appeal to it, kind of throw the bums out kind of attitude. And I always liked Mark Twain's quote that diapers and politicians should be changed regularly for the same reason. And so it's always been a popular item.
Okay. Yes. All right. That's very good. Well, let's start back at the beginning again with the Articles of Confederation and how they did have term limits in the Articles. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. Most often today, when we talk about term limits, we think of the type of term limits we have on the president, where he can serve 2 terms, and then after that, he's ineligible to serve for the rest of his life. But the founders would often think more in terms of a rotation in office, and we find that in the Articles of Confederation in Article 5, which specified a limit for the members of Congress, is that they were limited to serving for 3 years out of a period of 6. So let's say somebody served 3 years, they'd have to take 3 years off, but then they were eligible to serve again for another period of 3 years.
Okay. But let's talk about then what the framers had. They didn't include term limits. Am I right?
Right. And for Congress, yeah, I think they would argue that what they did is they shortened the term down to a 2-year term, so there were frequent elections. They saw that as an alternative, I think, to term limits. But actually, we can look to the states as well for experience with term limits. There are 15 states that have term limits on their legislators. Of those 15, though, 6 of them have the lifetime term limit, similar to what we do for president, but a majority of them, 9 of them, have the rotation in office scheme, similar to what we see in the Articles of Confederation.
Okay. And of course, we got to remember, at the time of the founding, or when the Constitution was created, the state legislatures appointed the senators, so there wasn't an election per se at that time for state senators. So the term limits were kind of built into what the legislators wanted to do.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, all right. Well, then came along the 17th Amendment,
Right.
and that changed everything, with regard to senators. Um, so now then we had to have term limits. Then we need to. Of course, the senators were set up every 6 years. So, but they became now subject to election. And now you had talked about the state examples, right?
Right. Now, and there's an additional 6 states which had term limits on their legislators, but in those states, those laws were either repealed or struck down by their courts. What I personally believe is one of the advantages of a convention of states is that we could get all of the states together, and with the experience they've had with both rotation in office and lifetime term limits, states that have implemented term limits, states that haven't, states that have had it and then backed away from it. I think there's a wealth of knowledge there that they could come up with a great proposal for what might work for the federal government.
Okay. All right. Good. Well, I know in my research, Paul, I found that the term for Congress of 12 years seemed to be kind of a popular period. That if an amendment was in fact passed regarding term limits for Congress, that would be a pretty popular time period. In other words, 6 terms in the House of Representatives, 2 terms in the Senate, or a combination of the two. Is that kind of what you thought, or what you saw?
That's a pretty popular scheme. And in fact, back in the fall of 2016, the Convention of States conducted a simulated convention. And that, in fact, is one of the proposed amendments that came out of that simulated convention, was a 12-year limit. And it, you serve your time either in the House or the Senate, but
Right.
12 years combined.
Now, I also found when it came to the judicial side, this got very interesting, actually. I also saw 12 years as being recommended, but I also saw 18 years being recommended.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought this was very interesting. What would happen when, let's just take Supreme Court judges. When you consider that they're being selected to serve 12-year terms, not lifetime terms. One of the reasons in favor of this that I came across that I thought was very interesting was the presidential selections could in fact be for judges with more experience, since they're only going to be in there for 12 years rather than a lifetime appointment, which generally garners a younger justice with possibly less experience than an older justice. So I found that very, very interesting. Did you come up with any other possibilities on judicial?
Well, again, 12 years is pretty common. And in fact, Mark Levin, in his book, The Liberty Amendments, has a similar proposal for the Supreme Court of a 12-year term. But he goes a step further and suggests structuring the justices into groups of 3. And then in every 4 years, you would appoint 3 new justices that structure them so their terms would expire. In kind of doing the math on that means every president would get to select a third of the Supreme Court anew with each of their terms.
Okay, all right.
And another thing that's interesting to me, again, going to our experience in the states, for state courts, there are 33 of the states that have term limits on their state justices, but in every case, it's a mandatory retirement age rather than a set term limit. Indiana, for example, has a mandatory retirement age of 75 for their state justices. And among all the states, it's roughly anywhere between age 70 and age 90 that they require their justices to retire.
Oh, very interesting. Interesting. So not based on term limits in any way. It's a age requirement then, huh?
Right.
Yeah.
So what fascinates me about this topic is it seems to be one that's simple, easy to understand, very popular. But when you start to dig into it, there's a lot more nuance to it and complexities in different ways that you could structure it.
Right. Right. Well, to wrap it all up here, I think the basic position of Convention of States is obviously this is an item in our resolution, which would be part of the subject matter of the and set the agenda for the convention. But term limits is in our resolution, and I think basically what we're saying with regard to the power and money and the imbalance between the states and the federal government with regard to control, this is a major contributing factor.
Absolutely.
To that, and I think if and you will and we'll see this in our basics presentation that returning that balance of power between the federal government and the states, that career politicians have a direct effect on that out of balance condition right now. So,
right.
So the Convention of States position is this is something that we would really like to see happen. Any other thoughts on your end, Paul, with regard to our position on this?
Well, I get one of the issues is that there is a 95% incumbent reelection rate among the federal legislature. So there's great power in incumbency and the ability to get reelected, and term limits could kind of blunt that a little bit and balance things out.
Okay. All right. Well, interesting topic, and it will be discussed many more times and at great length, I'm sure. So very interesting topic. So thank you very much, Paul. And thank you for participating. And we'll be, let's see if there's any, okay. All right. I don't see any comments so far. So you must have really done a good job, Paul.
Yeah, we must have covered it all.
All right. All right. Thanks. Have a good evening.
Thanks.
Okay. We're going to try and now bring up the PowerPoint again. I'm going to give it one more try here as we now get into the basics part of our presentation this evening, and we'll see what happens. Well, apparently, I don't think it's going to happen tonight. So, sorry, and I apologize for that. But we will. Hopefully, you can see this, and we'll get going on it and do the best we can with it. When we talk about the basics of Convention of States, we're talking about basically three tenets within Convention of States. And our basics are broken down between the problem, the solution, and the plan. All right. Now, the problem, if we had to sum it up in one sentence, the problem is that we see with the federal government is that our government's out of control, basically. And when we say out of the control, we mean they lack the will and the courage to address certain basic structural issues within our government. Now, we do realize, and we do want to make it clear that we're not blaming any one political party here for this situation. Both political parties have contributed over the years, and this has been going on for decades, folks. This is not something that happened just with the current administration or previous administration. This has been going on for decades, and like we said, our officials in Washington D.C. lack the will and the courage to address these structural issues. Now we further break the problem down into three abuses by the federal government. The first abuse has to do with our national debt. Now we're not going to go into detail on these this evening, but I'm sure you're familiar with these. The first one is the national debt. As you know, the national debt is in excess of $22 trillion now. So very little, if anything, is being done to address this situation. So this is an issue in this country that needs to be addressed, and it's not being addressed. The second abuse that we have identified has to do with what we refer to as the regulatory crisis in our country. And that's the administrative state, which now comprises the fourth branch of government. So, yes, I know the current administration has eliminated a lot of regulations, but much, much more needs to be done in this area. Not only regulations, but also implementing controls over the agencies and individuals involved in creating these regulations. And the third abuse has to do with the power structure between the states and the federal government. And again, this is where, as we talked about in our discussion on term limits, this is where the career politician comes into play, and the power struggle between the states and the federal government. When the government was founded, there was a concept in play called dual federalism, where the federal government and the states were supposed to share control and power. Well, that's tilted all in favor of the federal government. So we think term limits will come into play in this particular abuse. What's our solution? Well, our solution is to conduct a convention of states for the purpose of amending the Constitution to address these abuses. Now, we're not making this up. This is right in Article 5 of our Constitution. Article 5 describes the two methods of ways to amend the Constitution. Now, let's just briefly look at each one real quick. The first method is the method that we have known so far, and that's where 2/3 of Congress can propose amendments or an amendment, and then those proposals have to go through the ratification process, which involves 3/4 of the state legislatures must ratify. Now that's 38 states must ratify any amendment or amendments before they become amendments to the Constitution. All right. Well, there's a second method, and the second method, let me make a little adjustment here. The second method is whereby if 2/3 of the state legislatures apply to conduct a convention of states where amendments can be proposed, then this convention must happen if 2/3 of the states make application for it to happen. Now, this has not occurred in our history, so we'll be the first ones to do this. So, upon application of 2/3 of the states, which would be 34 states, then the convention would take place. Any proposed amendments that would come out of that convention would have to go through the same ratification process as in the first method, 38 states or 3/4 of the state legislatures would have to ratify any proposed amendments. So, as I said, we're not making this up. Both of these methods are right clearly stated in Article 5 of our convention of our Constitution. All right, well, what's our plan? Our plan's in two parts. The first has to do, I mentioned application, applying to have the Convention of States. It's also referred to as the resolution. Okay. And in the application or the resolution, the subject matter of that application is what determines the agenda of the convention. In Convention of States, we have literally designed this application to address the three abuses that I mentioned earlier. Number one, fiscal restraints. Number two, control on the federal government. And number three would be to address term limits. So those are the three areas of the subject matter of our application. As I said, we need 34 states to apply. We have 15 that have applied. And Indiana, as a matter of fact, is one of the 15 states that has passed this resolution. Now, the other part of our plan is mobilization of the grassroots. And when I say grassroots, I'm talking about you, me, our state legislators, mobilizing these people to bring this about and to get the states, the 34 states necessary for this convention to occur. And we're in all 50 states now. Convention of States is in all 50 states. Where our momentum is building. As I mentioned earlier, we have over 30,000 supporters here in the state of Indiana. Nationally, we're in excess of 3.8 million supporters. So our momentum is moving and we're growing very quickly. So I encourage you, please, to consider joining in with us to make this happen. So that is our presentation on the basics this evening. And I just want to close out with just remind you that now our next broadcast will be May 6th, a week from this evening. We're going to ask Paul to come back and help me. We're going to discuss the topic of subsidies. And this is a topic that Paul has addressed in one of his podcasts. So I'm going to be letting Paul take the lead on this discussion. But this ought to be very, very interesting. You hear the topic bantered around frequently about government subsidies. So I think we're going to have a very, very interesting discussion. Once again, I just want to leave you with the quote that I like to talk about and like to close out every broadcast with, and that is a quote from the president of Convention of States, Mark Meckler, where Mark says, there's a fundamental question facing our country today, and that question is not what should we do? The question is, who will decide? And I think that is very appropriate. The question is, who will decide? And in Convention of States, we want to see we the people to have more say so in who makes the decisions in our country. All right, folks. Once again, thank you for tuning in this evening. Keep in mind now that we will be back on air again next Monday, May 6th. And I just wanted to mention some of the people that have tuned in this evening. We have a person by the name of Joe Vega. Joe, thank you for tuning in. James Cressy, excuse me. James has been kind of a regular with us. I believe James is from Missouri. So once again, welcome. And here's one of our own, Jerry Rowe, has tuned in this evening. And so we always appreciate him tuning in. So thank you all for watching us this evening. And we will see you next Monday on May 6th. Have a good evening, everyone. Good night.